thank you, Mr. Zuckerman and Mr. Wasner, for your moving contribution to today's ceremony. You remind us of the truth that music can bring in ways that words alone cannot. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Petra Gelbart, Romani educator, scholar, and musician. Dr. Gelbart is also co-founder of the Initiative for Romani Music at New York University. Dr. Gelbart is the granddaughter of Romani Holocaust survivors, Helena, Margita, Nová and Antonín, Ruda, Hránek. And it is in their names that she speaks to us today.
Hello, Lačadives, Teaven Bachtale. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak at this year's Holocaust commemoration. In 2022, the overwhelming majority of students in America and beyond are unable to answer one question: who are Roma and Sinti? Our origins in South Asia come as a shock to most people, as does our Indic language. And if they have heard of so-called gypsies during the Holocaust, it is most often as an incidental footnote. The Romani people murdered during World War II numbered in the hundreds of thousands. I believe it's historiographically impossible to give a more exact number. But I will tell you that my childhood home, the Czech Republic, was one of several countries in which 80% of Roma and Sinti, or more, were killed during the Holocaust. My grandmother was born in a Slovak Romani settlement. During the war, her brother and some other relatives joined the resistance fighters. Even a false accusation of such an act often led to entire Romani villages being burned. Several of my grandmother's family members were taken to concentration camps. Her parents and many other Roma were killed during the Nazis' attack on the settlement. Grandma escaped on her sister's back through the freezing river before hiding in the woods. Although Romani men, women, and children were rounded up under various circumstances, ultimately they were all subject to the Nuremberg laws starting in November of 1935. Eventually, the final solution was designed to exterminate all whole and part Roma, along with the Jews. My grandfather, whose surname at birth was Holomek, escaped from a gathering camp in the Czech Republic with his mother and siblings. One brother died, however, when he fell ill, and the local hospital refused to treat him on racial grounds. Meanwhile, his father and another brother ended up in a subcamp of the Mauthausen complex before running away and spending the rest of the war in hiding. My grandfather's older sister went through several concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Among Czech Roma and Sinti, the family was extremely fortunate to have so many surviving members. At some unknown point in time, my great-grandfather had the family name changed from an obviously Romani one to something inconspicuous. This man, Josef Holomek, or Hránek, had the greatest hand in raising my mother. She was born shortly after the war into an unspeakably traumatized family. My mother grew up with Romani laws and customs, which include elaborate burials, always in a coffin, but not for Josef. He said, "They burned my whole family, so let me be burned too." Not quite 30 years after the war, he ended his life by suicide and was cremated. Josef's story is important because he was a leader in a community that has all but disappeared. It is important because his ashes are a statement of commemoration and warning that he himself authored. His story should be known even by those who somehow do not believe that Roma and Sinti were victims of the Holocaust, because Josef happened to be half Jewish. Why is it so important to know who Romani people are? Because Josef's great-great-grandchildren are still being threatened, mistreated, and attacked for the color of their skin. One of the most compelling ways to learn about fascist ideologies is to follow their unbroken thread into the 21st century. Surviving Romani families have countless points to make about racism in the past, present, and future. Thank you for taking the time to listen and to fulfill the meaningful objectives of Holocaust education.
Thank you, Dr. Gelbart, for those powerful words. We now welcome Mr. Elisha Wiesel. Mr. Wiesel is the only child of Holocaust survivors Marion and Elie Wiesel. He speaks to us today of the legacy he has inherited.
I have 3 minutes with you to reflect upon the Holocaust whose flames consumed the Jewish people, my family. My first minute is for the victims. My father Elie Wiesel and grandfather Shlomo, Zichronam Livracha, chose the death march to Buchenwald over the risk of being executed in the Auschwitz infirmary. Tomorrow, January 28th, marks the night my grandfather died 77 years ago, my father powerless to help him. Today, January 27th, marks the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz, which they had missed by only a few short weeks. But it was not the first day the world knew about the death camps. How must it have felt to learn after the war of Breckinridge Long, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State in charge of visa disbursement, who pushed FDR to keep American shores closed to Jewish refugees? To learn that the Allies knew about Auschwitz and chose not to bomb the rail lines or even broadcast a radio warning to Europe's Jews that they should not, under any circumstance, get on the trains. My second minute is for the children of survivors. We were born with a burden. We were born to parents who had survived incalculable pain, who somehow radiated hope despite the world's betrayal. How did they do it? Live life again? Love? Raise families? The truth is that if all we did was live, that would have been enough. We have already brought our parents some peace, some justice, by living our million small acts of daily life. But if you are like me, it did not feel like enough. Now I feel I too must do something to honor and continue the Jewish life of my ancestors and to speak up against the anti-Semitism that nearly extinguished us. Because it still exists today. Over 6 million Jews living in Israel descend from refugees who fled the Holocaust in Europe, pogroms in Russia, or the Farhud in the Arab Middle East. And last year, the United Nations General Assembly condemned Israel more than it condemned Iran, North Korea, and Syria combined. The world's double standards threaten the security of Jews everywhere. My third minute is for all of you who have joined us today. My father firmly believed that his faith required him to fight hatred and oppression everywhere, in places like Cambodia, Darfur, Rwanda, and Bosnia. Are we brave enough to follow? China, which sits on the Human Rights Council, inflicts mass internment, forced labor, and forced sterilization on the Uyghur people. As the world turns a blind eye to the forced separations and cultural eradication of Uyghur families, other oppressors, Myanmar, ISIS, and the Taliban, breathe easier as they oppress the Rohingya, the Yazidi, and women. I have met with Uyghur dissidents, and I believe their testimony. Will we pretend nothing is wrong? We must instead provide refuge to the Uyghur people and stand vigil for the disappeared, Kurban Mahmut, Yalkun Rozi, Ilham Tohti, to name a few. Beijing's Winter Olympics begin next week. Now is the time for us to act. Will the UN invoke the Genocide Convention's obligation to investigate what is happening in Xinjiang? We are out of time. May our actions this year be worthy of the weight of this day.
Thank you, Mr. Wiesel. We now turn to the heart of our ceremony, the voices and reflections of witnesses to the Holocaust and the elders who were there, who remained. 4 survivors have generously given their time to share with us their reflections of that period and their hopes for the future. We will begin by listening to Ms. Ella Blumenthal. Ms. Blumenthal was born in Poland in 1921. She was 18 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Of her 27 immediate family members, only Ms. Blumenthal and her niece Roma survived the Holocaust. Ms. Blumenthal survived the Warsaw Ghetto in 3 camps, the death camps at Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen before being liberated. Forced to leave Poland, Ms. Blumenthal eventually made her way to South Africa. She speaks to us from her home in Cape Town.
It's difficult to define the darkest moment. One of them was when I realized that the Nazis are trying to exterminate all the Jews. And this is when I realized when I lost every member of my family, one by one, I knew this is going to be the end. This is what they're trying to do to us, to exterminate every one of us. There should be nobody left. I realized that I want to live, I want to survive, I want to tell the world what has been happening, what happened to us Jews, and that's what kept me going, and the faith of God and the strength of survival. I knew and I hoped that I will manage to get through it, to come out alive. I don't know how I managed, but I realized that I've got to leave my past behind me. I've got to carry on. I've got to go on. I've got to try and build a family. I wanted to go on. I want to build a new life. Remember that one person must be able to speak to another person. It doesn't matter what religion or what color he is. You must understand that we are all the same. We want to understand each other, and then the world will be so much better for it.
Thank you, Ms. Blumenthal, for your wisdom and inspiration. We now turn to Mr. Pinchas Guter. Mr. Guter was also born in Poland. He was 7 when the Second World War began, and after his father was brutally beaten by Nazi thugs, Mr. Guter, his twin sister, and his mother, disguised as Christians, fled to their aunt in Warsaw. His father followed. In 1943, the Nazis deported the family from the Warsaw Ghetto to Majdanek. Only Mr. Guter survived the Holocaust. Forced to do slave labor, Mr. Guter survived Majdanek, 5 other concentration camps, including Buchenwald, and a death march from Germany to what was then Czechoslovakia, where he was liberated in 1945 by Soviet troops. He was 13 years old. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration brought Mr. Guter to England with other child Holocaust survivors for rehabilitation. Mr. Guter is married to Dorothy, and their family now spans 3 generations. He speaks to us from his home in Toronto, Canada.
My worst moment was when we were discovered in the bunker in Warsaw Ghetto when the uprising started on the 9th of April. We were there 3.5 weeks in the bunker. I knew that we were going to die because we knew that all the Jews in Warsaw Ghetto were going to be taken to Treblinka and going to be murdered. And then we were chased to the wagons. And my father was like an angel. He pushed us to the little window with a barbed wire so we could breathe, because they put so many people in that some people actually on the journey died from suffocation. When we were chased into the barrack and told to undress naked, and my father was undressing, and then we were running naked with our hands in the air, and my father was running in front. My father told me that if I'm asked, and that was before, I should say I'm 6 years older, I was a head taller than my twin sister, so I could actually pass for 16. I was 11, but I could pass for 16. And there was a man with a white coat with a little stick, and he would change people right, left, right, left, right, left. And he pushed me into a place, and I kind of finished up in a place, and there were shower heads, and I started saying my prayers because we knew in the ghetto that the shower heads are false, and the gas comes out, and we are going to die. So I started saying my prayers before dying, and then water came out in my place. And then suddenly, after they finished, they chased us to another barrack, they gave us prison clothes, and then I thought my father must be alive too, and I ran out and I started looking for my father because there was going to be a roll call. And I looked, and I couldn't find him. And then the next day, I found out that my mother, my father, and my sister were murdered by the Nazis. And that was, it almost, I turned almost into a nothing. I felt that my life had no meaning, that I lost everything. And what kept me going was, I believe, that Providence kept me going. And it was I a great belief, you know, when I see my father, he was like an angel with wings, and I kept on remembering that he was the one who kept me. That what sustained me. That's what kept me going. Number one, being numb and make myself invisible. That was the most important. You had to make yourself invisible. For the next 10 years, I never ever thought about the Holocaust. My brain did something that it made me not think about anything. I didn't think about my family. I didn't think about anything. I lived again. I lived in that moment. Of course, 10 years later, I started suffering very badly. And for years and years and years, I suffered. And it was Dorothy, my wife, that she kept me alive. She's the one who saved me. I am alive today because she looked after our children. She helped me, you know, when I was screaming at night, and I was very poor. I had to work every day to bring food on the table. We've been married now since 1957, and we still love each other as much as before. And it was thanks to her that I actually survived, and that my kids are okay. I didn't tell them everything. The Holocaust is right inside you. You can't run away from it. It's part of you. It's going to be with you until the day you die. And if you have a soul and the soul goes to heaven or wherever it goes, I mean, that soul is still going to remember the Holocaust. So there's no running away from it. And I would like to hand this message over to the world. I have a torch, which I want to give, which I give to the children, and I want to give to the world. And my torch has got more than one flame. It's got many flames. And to give you just an example of some of them, my torch has got no racial discrimination, no religious discrimination, no homophobia, no xenophobia, and above all, no hate. Hate is vicious. Hate is pernicious. Hate creates vengeance. Hate is something that should disappear from the world because it brings about vengeance. And this is the flame. Please take those flames and make them flame and make the world a much better place than it is at the moment. And the only way to do it is if everybody would get together and make the world shine and bright and spread the flame of goodwill. Please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Guter and Ms. Blumenthal, for sharing your memories and reflections. We value and appreciate you. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor John K. Roth. Professor Roth is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights, now the Mugray-Biyun Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. Professor Roth has written extensively on the Holocaust and its impact on our understanding of ethics, justice, and morality. Professor Roth speaks to us from his home in Washington State in the United States.
It's a privilege and an honor to be with you today to consider memory, dignity, and justice. No longer under a Nazi death sentence after the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, an Italian Jew named Primo Levi became a writer with unsurpassed insight about the Holocaust. A key source of Levi's insight was Lorenzo Perrone, the person Levi credited with saving his life. Not a Jew, but an Italian civilian, Lorenzo, a skilled bricklayer, was conscripted by the Germans to help build an industrial plant that they were constructing near Auschwitz. After meeting Levi in late June 1944, as they labored at the construction site, Lorenzo decided to help his fellow Italian. For months and at great risk, Lorenzo got Levi extra food, which was the physical difference between life and death. I believe that I owe it to Lorenzo if I am alive today, Levi would write, underscoring that Lorenzo's help meant much more than food alone. What also sustained him was that Lorenzo, said Levi, constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that a just world still existed outside ours. Something and someone still pure and whole, said Levi, not corrupt, not savage, unconnected to hatred and fear, something difficult to define, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. When liberation came, Levi lost track of Lorenzo. They reconnected in Italy after the war, but soon Lorenzo died. Levi's recollections of him are memorable. Lorenzo was not religious, Levi said. He didn't know the gospel, but instinctively he tried to rescue people, not for pride, not for glory, but out of a good heart and for human comprehension. He asked me once, said Levi, in very laconic words, why are we in the world if not to help each other? At one of their post-war meetings, Levi learned that he was not the only Auschwitz prisoner whom Lorenzo had helped, but Levi's friend had rarely told that story. In Lorenzo's view, wrote Levi, we are in the world to do good, not to boast of it. Memory, dignity, justice. Our concerns on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day were also Primo Levi's. He never forgot Lorenzo and the dignity his life-saving gifts restored. Lorenzo despised hatred and fear. So did Levi. Resisting savagery and corruption, they both defended justice. But what about Lorenzo's telling Levi that we are in this world to do good? Was Lorenzo naive? Was he gullible, even stupid? Anyone who supports the principles and purposes of the United Nations, everyone who pursues Holocaust education should hope not, because we think we are helping and doing good. In late January 2022, however, we cannot easily be optimistic about our hope because the Holocaust is a warning. That has been said before, but now the Holocaust's warning for us resounds with urgency. It does so because the catastrophe did not erupt out of the blue, nor was it fated to happen. Human decisions and policies in the 1930s led to disaster. Destructive versions of them are widespread in the 2020s. In our times, the Holocaust warns against autocracy and obedience to it. The Holocaust cries out, beware of big, repeated lies, conspiracy theories, disrespect for evidence and truth, and disregard for language that defames and thus inflames division and violence. If such alarms are ignored, the world is worse for it. Absent lies and liars, especially big lies and liars with authoritarian power, the Holocaust would not have happened. Nor could autocratic Nazi power advance without the compliance and complicity it needed and received from leaders in every sector of German life. Education, law, politics, science, medicine, business, the arts, religion. The Nazis' lethally racist anti-Semitism rested on falsehoods. Nazi power arose because Hitler and his followers bogusly and repeatedly insisted that Germany's defeat in World War I resulted from a stab-in-the-back conspiracy that never happened. Nazi propaganda overrode contrary evidence, calling it fake news, and Hitler's vows to destroy the Jews, who were slandered as a disease-spreading, toxic pestilence in the body politic, show how malignant language becomes deadly. If we are warned and persuaded in time, what should doing good require when forces like those that stupidly ignited the Holocaust also threaten in 2022 what the United Nations Charter calls respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all? On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, 4 points about doing good are especially important. Borrowing 3 from the small but powerful book called On Tyranny by the Yale University historian Timothy Snyder, I will add my commentary and close with a 4th point of my own. First, Snyder urges, be as courageous as you can. Lorenzo could not help everyone, but he saved Primo Levi. None of us can do everything that is needed to honor human dignity and advance justice, but even small deeds and modest actions are significant. Think of voting or teaching in that way. Holocaust education today must underscore the responsibility to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms as best we can. Second, Snyder urges, be a patriot. Set a good example for the generations to come. Being a patriot is not the same as being a nationalist. A nationalist says, my country right or wrong, or my nation's might makes right. By contrast, Snyder says, a patriot wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. Our best selves resist decisions and policies like those that led to the Holocaust. Our best selves reject anti-Semitism and racism. They oppose hypocrisy and autocracy. Our best selves hold torturers accountable. They strive to bring murderers to justice. Our best selves do not restrict and abuse human rights. They defend and strive to expand them. Our best selves never give up trying to be their best. Third, Timothy Snyder urges, believe in truth. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. Snyder tells how truth dies. Hostility to verifiable reality lets inventions and lies become facts. Then blunt and endless repetition of those inventions and lies makes the fictional plausible and the criminal desirable. Snyder's warning is that post-truth is pre-fascism. He continues, fascists despise the small truths of daily existence, loved slogans that resonated like a new religion, and preferred creative myths to history or journalism. They used new media, which at the time was radio, to create a drumbeat of propaganda. And now, as then, many people confused faith in a hugely flawed leader with truth about the world we all share. The Holocaust happened not only because the Nazis abandoned truth, but also because so many other people went along. Doing good in 2022 requires breaking silence, affirming facts against fantasies, and defending truth against lies, big and small. Finally, doing good, especially giving memory of the Holocaust the respect it deserves, depends on taking nothing good for granted. So quickly and in such devastating ways, the conditions that led to the Holocaust, as well as the Holocaust itself, swept away what is right and just, good and true. Doing good in our times requires us to stand with Primo Levi's life-saving friend Lorenzo, to be our best selves as patriots who believe in truth, take nothing good for granted, and act as courageously as we can. If memory of the Holocaust leads us that way, we can renew respect for human dignity and justice and help to mend our endangered world.
Thank you very much, Professor Roth. We now turn to Holocaust survivor Rabbi Arthur Schneier. Rabbi Schneier was born in Austria and witnessed the destruction wrought by anti-Semitism, both on an intimate scale, as former friends turned on him, and a much wider scale on the Jewish community during the November 1938 pogrom. The 9-year-old Arthur fled with his mother to Hungary, where they hoped in vain to find visas to escape Europe. Through the courageous efforts of diplomats such as Karl Lutz, the Swiss Consul General, and the International Red Cross, Arthur and his mother were able to survive the war. But most of Rabbi Schneier's family did not. Rabbi Schneier arrived in the United States in 1947, filled with a desire to build a world where justice and peace prevailed. His legacy of leadership on behalf of religious freedom and human rights is profound, and a testimony to those and to the family in whose name Rabbi Schneier has worked tirelessly for peace and mutual respect. He speaks to us from Park East Synagogue in New York, where he is the senior rabbi.
At the age of 8, in my birthplace, Vienna, one of the most painful, shocking, tragic moments was March 13, 1938, when the Nazis took over my birthplace, Vienna. I had many, many Christian friends attending school together, visiting their homes. They visited our homes. Overnight, at the behest of their parents, they lost contact with me. I was excluded from the school and even turned against me. Now, these kids were taught how to hate. They were not born with hatred. They were taught how to hate. So September 1, 1939, when World War II broke out, we fled to my grandparents, a very prominent rabbi in Hungary, and we were illegal aliens. And then in 1943, 425,000 Hungarian Jews cleansed in no time. And I owe my life to Karl Lutz, a Swiss Consul General, who, like Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, established for a few thousand Jews in each house, safety houses. So that gives one hope that there's not only evil, but there's goodness and kindness in so many human beings who are ready to help their neighbor and their fellow man. What gave me actually hope and a desire for survival was hoping that I would be able to leave the blood-soaked continent of Europe, including my hometown, and find my way with my mother, who survived, to finally come to the United States, a land of freedom. And then made up my mind that I will devote every day of my life to make sure that no other people would have to endure the kind of suffering that we did during the Holocaust. Now, my message to the young people today: understand the diversity of the human family. And finally, hear the cry of the oppressed, because we are one human family.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Schneier. We now turn to listen to Ms. Vered Kuter. Ms. Kuter was born in 1943 into war in Nazi-occupied Netherlands. The family was forced to hide just to survive. However, they were unable to hide together as a family. Fortunately, though, through the efforts of her father's employer, a safe home was found for Vered with Dutch family friends. These friends risked their lives to conceal Vered's Jewish identity. After the war, Ms. Kuter decided to become a nurse. She has built a legacy as a health worker, traveling to developing countries to administer aid to people in need. She often also shares in-depth accounts of her story of survival. In 2019, Ms. Guterres delivered her testimony during the annual Holocaust observance organized by the UN Information Center in Yangon, Myanmar. Today, Ms. Guterres speaks to us from her home in Jerusalem.
The darkness, I suppose, it was the first 3 months which I spent in a cupboard. I was 6 weeks old and I was hidden in a cupboard till I started making too much noise, and the person that took me and hid me at his sister's house where he worked during the week decided that I should go with him to his village. And then a very dark moment happened. They gave me a sleeping pill. I was 3 months old, wrapped me up in a cardboard box, and he traveled with me for more than 2 hours to his wife and presented me, this is a baby, and this is ours now. And in the village they spread the story I was the daughter of the unmarried sister of my warfather. And that was a very good story because I had blue eyes and blonde hair, so I was a German baby. When the Holocaust ended, I didn't have any hope. I was taken away from 2 loving people and put into my family. I'm not sure what gave me hope to continue. I think the visits that I was allowed in the school holidays to spend with my war parents, the love I received there, because my home was broken up, everybody was growing differently, not like a real family. So the hope I had was given through the love of my war parents. The message I would like to give, not only to the youth, to everybody: accept people as they are, but start with accepting yourself and believe in yourself that you can share and give and love other people. Never do anything to anybody else that you don't want to happen to yourself. Try and love people like you want to be loved. That's the message I would like to share.
Thank you, Ms. Guterres, and also Rabbi Schneier, for sharing your reflections with us and for inspiring us all to work for a better world. The Holocaust had a profound impact on the world. Some 77 years later, it continues to reverberate, touching the lives of people around the globe and shaping the choices they make and their values. This year, we have invited 5 people from diverse regions, age, gender, and ethnicity to share with us how they have been shaped by their encounter with the history of the Holocaust. Please join me as we hear from United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Alice Nderitu, Director of the Tokyo Holocaust Education Resource Center, Fumiko Ishioka, Curator, Education Consultant, and Educator Paul Salmons, Journalist Boris Tull, and Founder and Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and Chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, Tali Nates.
My first recollection of the word Holocaust came from my grandfather. My father would buy, for me and my brothers, second-hand comic books on the Second World War, and we would be reading through and admiring the fighter pilots and the jets that they flew. And my grandfather, who was a veteran who had fought in both the First and the Second World Wars, was the person who spoke to me and said that I should read those comic books with fahamu, which is a Kiswahili word for consciousness. He said, you know, war is not good. The bombs that were dropped by the fighter pilots kill people. And human beings have this tendency to fight against each other and to resolve issues through violence. And you must find a way to ensure that this does not happen. And then I asked him, what is the worst possible thing that you think happened during the First and Second World Wars? And he said it was definitely the Holocaust. And he said he talked about Auschwitz, and he talked about the kind of things that happened there. And it took this consciousness about what war means and why my grandfather, who'd fought in 2 wars, kept saying that it was bad, began to grow in me through this fahamu, that I was able to create fahamu, this consciousness, so that everything I read, I thought about the impact, because that's what he said. He said, think about the impact of what was going on during the war. And when I then ended up invited to Auschwitz itself, and to be in Auschwitz and to then understand what war actually means. The impact on me from Auschwitz was huge. A few years later, I too started teaching in Auschwitz, teaching for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide. So the consciousness kept growing on me, and ultimately now I find myself in this position as the special advisor on the prevention of genocide, advising the Secretary General as an Under-Secretary General. And really, you cannot imagine a better position from which to articulate the values of fahamu that I learned from my grandfather, that I am in this space where I'm able to do something about it. And I do not imagine a single day when I do not walk into this office and think about fahamu, especially because I see those who deny the Holocaust, and those who deny genocides like those that happened in Srebrenica and in Rwanda against the Tutsi. The deniers of the genocides take the template from the deniers of the Holocaust. So I see the influence in so many negative ways. I also see it in positive ways, because there's a lot of history that I would never have learned if I did not approach the subject of the Holocaust with the fahamu, the consciousness that my grandfather, who was a veteran of both world wars, taught me.
Japanese society has many issues we struggle with, like hate speech, more recently, lessons of the Holocaust, especially the fact that Auschwitz didn't happen overnight, could, I thought, give us an opportunity to try to find a way to tackle with these issues from new, different perspective. And that became my life's work when I met an Auschwitz survivor, George Brady. At the age of 16, he lost his whole family, his parents and his little sister. And this empty suitcase, which had his sister's name, Hannah Brady, turned up at my center half a century later. After I tracked down George in Toronto, Canada, and the story of the sibling was turned into a book, I was fortunate to start visiting schools with George in many countries. As we traveled all over Canada, the United States, Mexico, Europe, and South Africa, I realized that responses from children are amazingly universal. They think of their families and their friends. They think of what they would do when they face prejudice and discrimination in their own lives. And George's message was always simple. We are all equal, we have to help each other. And this very simple message continued to resonate with me. I can't help but thinking, why is creating an equal world so hard to achieve? In Japan, Hannah's suitcase has traveled to over 1,200 schools and is still traveling. What I'm hoping is that if you can imagine what's in this one empty suitcase, you can learn to use the same empathy and desire to know more about another child. It's been a journey of 20 years, and I'm starting to see tiny little seeds growing as some of the students I met years ago are now in college and are coming back to us as volunteers. Seeing that keeps me going.
My background is as a secondary school history teacher. When I first became involved in Holocaust education, I had a rather generalist view of this history. There are certain stories that I'm still wrestling with that I haven't used in my educational work, but that cause deep reflection on my life and on the way I see the world around me. So there was a long process for me where, and it continues to this day, where I'm continually learning more about this history. In my view, this is a past that should be deeply unsettling. The questions that we ask about how this was possible, why it could happen, shouldn't be settled by easy answers, such as this is where hatred can lead. There are difficult, complicated issues here which go to the heart of what it means to be human. So how can we expect to try and answer those kinds of questions with a pithy slogan or an uplifting statement? The truth is that the deeper we go into this past, or I'm certain any history of any genocide or mass atrocity, the more troubling the questions will be, but of course also the more urgent it is to confront them. And through telling of those stories, we have to confront aspects of our humanity which we prefer not to look at. And it's this knowledge of what we're capable of what we have done, that creates this stain upon us today.
My story with the Holocaust dates back to my teenage years, when I used to go over my history lessons with my parents. I remember my father explaining to me the terrible treatment of the Nama and the Herero communities by the Germans. I later understood that these were the first recorded attempts of ethnic cleansing of the 20th century. My mother died in 2019. And a few months prior to that day, I received a grant to visit Poland and Germany. On the third day of my mom's passing, I flew to Warsaw, and then to other Polish cities where I visited sites commemorating the Holocaust, and where I was able to visit places of worship, the Jewish worship, places like cemeteries where entire Jewish families and communities were massacred. Then in Germany, I was able to also visit sites commemorating this inhumane part of history. On that study tour, I met Wanda and her son Luke. Wanda was a little girl when her family was forcibly placed in the ghettos of Poland. All this, I firmly believe, prepared me to transcend my own pain. I was able to learn their history through memories left on the walls. I was able to learn it through the eyes of their grandchildren, who dedicated their entire lives in the memory of their parents. Today I write, and in writing I believe that it's a way for me to never forget. As we cross the generations of Africa with the increasing disappearance of oral traditions, I think that writing will help me to never forget, and writing will help the next generations to understand what part of history should never be repeated.
I was born to a family of Holocaust survivors. My father, Moses Turner, survived 4 concentration camps and actually was saved by Oskar Schindler. He was on the famous now Schindler's List together with his brother, my uncle, Henrik Turner. My father, Moses Turner, lost though his mother, my grandmother Leah, and his 2 sisters, Hela and Sila. They were all murdered in Belzec killing center. And that's how I grew up. I grew up with the story of the Holocaust, and it influenced me a great deal. I studied history, and then I created this center that opened officially in March of 2019, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. It was a legacy in a way for my father, for my uncle. And what we do here at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is to look at the 20th century, a century of genocide, with a focus on the Holocaust and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And for me, it was very important to work not only in South Africa, but also in Africa. So work in Africa through the Change Makers program. And this program looks at the history of the Holocaust, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and apartheid in South Africa. So our work is really to make that connection faster, to learn from the past in order to fight extremism and to promote democracy and pluralism.
We have listened to survivors and to the children and grandchildren of survivors. Join me now in silent reflection as Cantor Daniel Mendelsohn of the congregation Kol Ami delivers the solemn prayer, El Malei Rachamim.
I'm going to offer the memorial prayer, El Malei Rachamim, for the victims of the Holocaust. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bameromim, Ametzei Menucha Nechona, Betzei Ganevei HaShechina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Teharim, Kezohar HaRakia, Meirim U'Mazhirim, Et Nishmot Acheinu V'Achioteinu Shenehergo V'Shenishchato V'Shenisrefu Chaim Al Kiddush Hashem Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, וכל מקומות השמד באירופה, בעבור שכולנו כל בני ישראל מתייחדים עם זכרם הקדוש, ומתפללים ביד עליית נשמותיהם בגן העדן, בגן תהיה מנוחתם, לכן בהל הרחמים יסדירם בזייתר גנפיו לעולמים ויצרור ויצרור החיים את נשמותיהם ארץ אל תכסי דמם וינוחו ושלום על משכבם ונאמר Amen.
Thank you, Cantor Mendelssohn, for leading us so gently in prayer. Excellencies, esteemed guests, friends, thank you for being with us today. The United Nations remains steadfast in our commitment to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to act to prevent anti-Semitism, racism, and prejudice. We commit to building a world of peace where every member of our beautiful human family can flourish. Thank you.